Welcome back, everyone. It's time for an exercise. There's not a whole lot we can build just yet. Hang in there. I promise these will get a bit more engaging and at least prettier as we go along, especially as we start making our projects and we learn a lot more CSS. But we have to start somewhere, and it's really important, in my experience, to have you practice. Right? When I'm teaching in the classroom, I can lecture for a little bit, but almost the entire day, 80% of a day, is students actually building and practicing things. So if you're flying through this course, especially if you're a beginner, make sure that you try and do these exercises. That's my personal advice as a teacher who's done this with a lot of students in person. I obviously can't force you to do any exercises, but even if they're dull, I highly recommend that you try it just so that you get that practice. You get that wiring in your brain from doing it yourself. It's very different from watching somebody drone on and on and on about a million different HTML topics. So this exercise is all about pasta. I'd like you to recreate this web page that you see right here. So there's a couple of things. There's obviously a heading. There's an image, and I've provided this image in a directory. If you download the starter code, it's called images, and it's pasta.png. It's just one image. Simple enough. And this is a recipe about how to make fresh pasta. It's not really a great recipe, but anyway, it is a recipe. We have a bulleted list that has 3 elements, right? Time, about 45 minutes, rating, 5, notes, community notes. There's a link there. We'll get to that in a moment. Notice that there's bold text here. It's up to you how you make this text bold. I mean, if you know CSS, you could do it with CSS. But we know 2 elements that by default have bold styles. You can pick one. Honestly, you could go either way. It's not super clear cut, but use one of the elements that makes text bold. And then there's a paragraph of text. If I were you, just put lorem ipsum here. Nobody cares if you have the exact same text as me. That's what I'm going to do in the solution, just lorem ipsum text a couple of times. And then we have another heading, a subheading, right? If you compare this to the main heading, we have 2 subheadings, preparation and community notes. And then preparation has 5 elements in a list. It's a numbered list, not bulleted. And these are short enough. You could type them out or just make up your own steps. 5 separate steps for making fresh pasta. The point is not about copying my text. The point is about using the right element. So do whatever you want as far as the content. And then finally, we have this subheading community notes. It's the same level as preparation. There's a paragraph of text. This was garbage and I hated it. Another paragraph. I prefer this recipe I found on the New York Times. This is a link to the New York Times website. So you don't have to use New York Times, but make sure it's a link to some valid website that is not a local link that a relative link or a separate web page you've made, but a hosted web page, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you want. I just chose New York Times because that's where a lot of recipes are. And then finally, this link right here, this actually links to the section called Community Notes. So when I click this link, you'll see it scrolls me down. Now, it doesn't scroll me all the way down to this. It does, but there's no content afterwards. We hit the end of the page. But if I had a lot of stuff after this, it would take me right here. So if you remember, we saw a video on how to do that, how to make an anchor tag that connects not to a separate web page, but to a different location on the same page. Let me show that one more time. If I click it, it scrolls me down to community notes. All right, so if you need a refresher on how to do that, go watch the video on anchor tags and relative links and linking within a page. Otherwise, try and recreate this. Don't worry about the content. Put whatever you want. Definitely put an image here. I'm providing you an image. You can use your own, but I want an image on the page. And then use the right headings and, of course, the proper document structure. You'll need to make your own HTML file, call it whatever you want, and pause the video and try and do it. Please, I am begging you to do it. If you're actually new to HTML, if this is your first exposure to these elements, please do it. Please. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So let me head over to my HTML or to my editor. I'll make a file. I'm going to call mine solution.html. And this time, for the sake of time, I'm going to hit exclamation point tab, which as we learned, just makes me the basic skeleton. And then I'm going to call this pasta recipe or something for the title. And then I'll put an H1 in here at the top that says fresh pasta dough. That should be the H1, right? It's the main topic of the page. It's the most important heading. And let's open this up in the browser, I'm going to use my live server. So right click, open with live server, and there it is. The next step is to get the image to show up. So how do I make an image? We use the img element. It's self-closing, so there's no closing tag. And then I have to specify the src attribute, the source. And that's going to be the images folder /pasta. That's where my image is. So if you're using the same one, it's images /pasta, or whatever the right path is, the location of your own image. And we should see, there it is. No, that's the solution. There it is. This is our version. And we're missing one thing. We should have an alt attribute to describe for screen readers, or in case this image never loads. Let's just call this, fresh made pasta or something. Won't see anything different, but now we have that alt text in there. Next up, we have 3 elements in a bulleted list. So how do we make that list? It is an unordered list, aka a UL, and then a bunch of LIs, right? Here's one LI, and we get the bulleted list, but I need to have text that says time, about 45 minutes, so we can start with that. And then another LI. This one is rating of 5. And then notes, which has a link to read community notes. We'll get to that in a moment. And let's just make sure we get our 3 bullet points, and we do. Great. So how about making this text bold? I said that there's 2 elements, but we learned 2 elements that by default make things bold. One of them is the strong element, which is used to indicate special importance and significance of content. We could use that here, but honestly, the way that this text is bolded is really more about maybe just highlighting it, bringing your attention to it, not necessarily making it significant. It's just a contrast between the topic, right, and then a colon, and then the corresponding information. Time, about 45 minutes. Rating, 5. It's more about just making it stand out, but not adding special significance. So I would argue this is probably a better use for the B tag, which used to be called bold. Now it's supposed to be called the bring attention to element, which is a huge pain to say. Most people just call it bold still. So let's wrap each one of these pieces with a B tag. Here's our version, and there we go. That's looking good. What do we have next? We have a big paragraph of text. So I'm just going to copy this, I guess. You could also just use lorem ipsum, but it should be a paragraph, right? And just as a reminder, you can do lorem tab, or you can even do fancier lorem times 4 tab or 3, right? And that makes us more lorem ipsum text. It doesn't really matter. I guess I'll put the original text that I had, but I don't want you to do that. That's a waste of your time to put the exact text in. Next up, where are we? We have another subheading. Well, actually our first subheading, preparation. So if we have an H1 and we have another heading, it should be an H2. So preparation is an H2. Preparation. There it is. And then we have an ordered list, right? It's not bullet points, it's numbered. And there's an order here because it's steps in a recipe, even if it's a very flawed recipe that doesn't quite make sense. We need to use an ordered list, which is an OL. And then each element is an LI. So here's our first one. Put whatever text you want. But there's our first one. It says number 1. And then we have beat together eggs, mix eggs with flour. This will be annoying to watch me do, but I guess I'll recreate it exactly. Put that in there. Transfer to counter, surface in need. Put that in there. And we're almost done. Here's our final one. Okay, so that should be 5 numbered points there, list elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then finally, we have community notes, which is another heading. It's on the same level of preparation, so that should be an H2 as well, right? It's not nested within, it's not a subtopic of preparation, it's a separate topic. But it is a subtopic of fresh pasta dough, the whole page topic. And then we have 2 community notes. I just made each one a paragraph. You could use a heading potentially, or even a UL of different LIs. But since we only have 2, this is fine. And then I'm going to do, I prefer this recipe I found on the New York Times. It's another paragraph. And this is supposed to be a link. I said it could go anywhere, so pick any website, but I'm going to do the New York Times. So the href needs to be http://www. and then nytimes.com for me. If that's what I'm going to use, let's make sure it works. And there we go. Okay, so the final piece is to make this a link that, when clicked, takes you to the community notes section. So if you remember, the way that we do that is by assigning an ID to some element. I'm going to call this ID on the H2 notes. Now you could put this anywhere, but it makes sense if I'm linking to this whole area of content to just link to the H1, or sorry, the heading, which in our case is an H2. Notes. Okay, so remember that. And then right here where it says read community notes, I'll make an anchor element and I will wrap that around just like that. And then the href is going to be equal to a # and then the ID of notes to match that right there. Let's see if it works. I'm going to scroll up as high as I can while still seeing the link. And there we are. It takes me to community notes, or at least takes me as far as it can. Now, if I had, let's do something extreme like lorem times 100. If I had a bunch of content underneath, now if I click this link, it takes community notes and puts that at the top of the page. We just didn't have enough content, and we don't need that. That's not part of the requirement here. And that's it for our simple exercise. Nothing revolutionary, nothing mind-blowing, but just more practice with the basic elements. Images, links, working with different types of links, nesting LIs inside of a UL, nesting LIs inside of an OL, headings, paragraphs, all that stuff. And not to mention proper document structure. All right, so that's it. We are almost done with HTML. We have a little bit more to cover around forms, and then we get to move on to CSS.